Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be looking at Chapter 2 of 1984. So this is a sub-assignment reading. You'll have to read Chapters 2 and 3. So this is an audio reading. I encourage you to follow along either on the video or in your own text. And I will be annotating on the screen. So anytime I circle something or highlight something on the text, that's something that should go in your notes because it's going to be key information for the plot for the rest of our story. Okay, so chapter 2 takes place at Winston's home. He again lives in a flat, and we kind of talked about the meaning of a flat versus an apartment, and the conditions are abysmal. Now, we see in chapter 2, we are introduced to his neighbor, and we really get more information about the state of 1984, the setting, the government through these chapters. So, all the introduction chapters, the goal is to classify this as a dystopia and to show how the government and their overreach is affecting citizens in their day-to-day lives. All right, so we're going to begin with chapter 2. Oh, comrade, I thought I heard you come in. Do you think you could come across and have a look at our kitchen sink? It got blocked up and it was Mrs. Parsons. She was about 30, but looking much older. She had the impression that there was dust in the creases of her face. Victory Mansions were old flats and were falling to pieces. The plaster flaked constantly from ceilings and walls. The pipes burst in every hard frost. The heating system was usually running at half steam when it was not closed down altogether from motives of economy. Repairs, except for what you could do yourself, had to be sanctioned by remote committees which were liable to hold up even the mending of a window pane for 2 years. Okay, one important thing here to note is the name of the flat that he lives in, Victory Mansions. This is, of course, an oxymoron. An oxymoron is something that is opposite of what is true. So the Victory Mansions are falling apart. But the word mansion obviously suggests something very famous and wealthy and, full of luxuries. The Parsons flat had a battered, trampled on look, as though the place had just been visited by some large, violent animal. Winston hated bending down, which was always liable to start him coughing. There was the usual boiled cabbage smell, common to the whole building, but it was shot through by a sharper reek of sweat. Of course, if Tom was home, he'd put it right in a moment. He loves anything like that. Parsons was Winston's fellow employee at the Ministry of Truth, of paralyzing stupidity. He was one of those completely unquestioning, devoted drudges on whom the stability of the party depended. He was a leading figure of the sports committee and all the other committees engaged in organizing community hikes and voluntary activities generally. An overpowering smell of sweat followed him about wherever he went and even remained behind him after he had gone. Up with your hands. You're a traitor, a Eurasian spy. I'll vaporize you. I'll send you to the salt mines. There was a sort of calculated ferocity in the boy's eye, a quite evident desire to hit or kick Winston, and a consciousness of being very nearly big enough to do so. It was a good job. It was not a real pistol he was holding, Winston thought. Traitor. Thought criminal. Mrs. Parsons' eyes flitted nervously from Winston to the children and back again. In the better light of the living room, he noticed with interest that there were actually dust in the creases of her face. They do get so noisy. They're disappointed because they couldn't go see the hanging. I'm too busy to take them, and Tom won't be back from work in time. Want to see the hanging. Want to see the hanging. Some Eurasian prisoners were to be hanged in the park that evening, Winston remembered. This happened about once a month, and children always clamored to be taken to see it. Okay, so this part is very important. So we hadn't gotten much information about children in society, but we can see what happens in this very violence-ridden, desensitized society. These children are essentially mimicking Hitler Youth. We even see the little ribbons that are red around their neck. That's very symbolic of Hitler Youth. The pictures here as well, very kind of Aryan-looking children. So because of the violence in society, I mean, they have public hangings for crying out loud that are entertainment. These children are seeing all of this as a game. And so Winston's there trying to fix the pipes, and For a moment, we think it's the actual thought police, and it's just these children that are kind of playing games. Now, we want to also notice Ms. Parsons' reaction. She's very nervous. So she seems to be afraid of her own children. Okay, and we'll find out why, because she does actually have good reason to do so. Okay, moving on. He had not gone 6 steps down the passage when something hit the back of his head, an astonishingly painful blow. It was as though a red-hot wire had been jabbed into him. Goldstein. Nearly all children nowadays were horrible by means of such organizations as spies. They were systematically turned into ungovernable little savages. They adored the party and everything connected with it, the songs, processions, banners, hiking, drilling with dummy rifles, the yelling of slogans, and the worship of Big Brother. It was all a sort of glorious game to them. It was almost normal for people to be frightened of their own children. Hardly a week passed in which the Times did not carry a paragraph describing how a child hero denounced his parents to the thought police. The sting of the catapult bullet had worn off. Suddenly he began thinking of O'Brien again. Years ago, how long was it? 7 years it must be. He had dreamed that he was walking through a pitch-dark room and someone sitting to one side of him said, "We shall meet in a place where there is no darkness." At that time, the words had not made much impression on him. It was only later and by degrees that they had seemed to take on significance. It was O'Brien who had spoken to him out of the dark. Winston did not know what it meant, only that it would, in some way or another, it would come true. Attention, your attention please. A news flash has this moment arrived from our Malabar front. Our forces in South India have won a glorious victory. Bad news coming, thought Winston. And sure enough, following on a gory description of the annihilation of a Eurasian army, came the announcement that, as from next week, the chocolate ration would be reduced from 30 grams to 20. The sacred principles of Ingsoc, Newspeak, doublethink, the mutability of the past. Winston felt as though he were wandering in the forest of the sea bottom, lost in a monstrous world where he himself was the monster, and he was alone. What certainty did he have that a single human creature now living was on his side? Even from the coin, the eyes pursued you. The past was dead. The future was unimaginable. On coins, stamps, banners, posters, and the wrapping of a cigarette packet, everywhere, always the eyes watching you and the voice enveloping you asleep, awake, working or eating, indoors or outdoors. No escape. Nothing was your own except a few cubic centimeters inside your skull. He wondered again for whom he was writing the diary. In front of him there lay not death, but annihilation. The diary would be reduced to ashes and himself to vapor. How could you make appeal to the future when not a trace of you, not even an anonymous word scribbled on a piece of paper could physically survive? To a time when truth exists and what is done cannot be undone, from the age of solitude, from the age of our big brother, from the age of doublethink, greetings. He was already dead, he reflected. Thought crime does not entail death. Thought crime is death. Now that he had recognized himself as a dead man, it became important to stay alive for as long as possible. 2 fingers of his right hand were ink-stained. It was exactly the kind of detail that might betray you. Some nosing zealot in the ministry might start wondering why he had been writing during some lunch interval, why he had used an old-fashioned pen, what he had been writing. He put the diary away in the drawer, and it was quite useless to think of hiding it, but he could at least make sure whether or not its existence had been discovered. A hair laid across the page ends was too obvious. With the tip of his finger, he picked up an identifiable grain of whitish dust and deposited it on the corner of the cover, where it was bound to be shaken off if the book was moved. Okay, so this is the end of chapter 2. Let's talk about a couple of things here. So this is almost like he's setting up a crime. He's looking at every single detail, whether he has pen ink on his finger, whether there is dust on the corner of the book to show whether it's moved or not. So he knows that eventually it's not a matter of if, but when he will be caught. He's resigned himself to this knowledge, and he really doesn't care that much. So remember, this love of life is something that doesn't exist in society. Every day is suffering, and he has found something that makes suffering worth it. So he doesn't really know if anyone's ever going to read this. He assumes that once he's found out, the book will be burned, and that will be that. But this is a spark, something that he can do that seems to matter in a world where nothing matters. Okay, now we're ready for chapter 3. Winston was dreaming of his mother. He must, he thought, have been 10 or 11 years old when she had disappeared. She was a tall, statuesque, rather silent woman with slow movements. His father he remembered more vaguely. He remembered especially the very thin soles of his shoes. The two of them must evidently have been swallowed up in one of the first great purges of the 50s. His mother was sitting in some place deep down beneath him, with his young sister in her arms, a tiny, feeble baby, always silent. They were in the saloon of a sinking ship, and they were down there because he was up here. There was no reproach either in their faces or in their hearts, only the knowledge that they must die in order that he might remain alive. The thing that now suddenly struck Winston was that his mother's death, nearly 30 years ago, had been tragic and sorrowful in a way that was no longer possible. Tragedy, he perceived, belonged to the ancient time, to a time when there was still privacy, love, and friendship. His mother's memory tore at his heart because she had died loving him when he was too young and selfish to love her in return. Such things, he saw, could not happen today. Today there was fear, hatred, and pain, but no dignity of emotion, no deep or complex sorrow. All this Winston seemed to see in the large eye of his mother and his sister, looking up at him through the green water, hundreds of fathoms down, and still thinking. Suddenly he was standing on a short springy turf, on a summer evening when the slanting rays of the sun gilded the ground. The landscape he was looking at recurred so often in his dreams that he was never fully certain whether or not he had seen it in the real world. In his waking thoughts, he called it the Golden Country. So we'll notice in the first chapter, the the town is pretty much covered in smog. And now he's having this landscape dream, not just of his mother and the love that she had for him, something that doesn't exist in their world anymore, but this beautiful, idyllic nature. It was an old rabbit-bitten pasture, with a foot track wandering across it and a molehill here and there. In the ragged hedge of the opposite side, the field of the boughs of the elm tree were swaying faintly in the breeze, their leaves just stirring in dense masses like women's hair. Somewhere near at hand, though out of sight, there was a clear, slow-moving stream where dace were swimming in the pools under the willow trees. A girl with dark hair was coming toward him, toward the field. With what seemed a single movement, she tore her clothing and flung them disdainfully aside. With its grace and carelessness, the gesture seemed to annihilate a whole culture, a whole system of thought, as though Big Brother and the party and the thought police could all be swept into nothingness by a single splendid movement of the arm. Winston woke up with the word Shakespeare on his lips. That, too, was a gesture belonging to the ancient time. The telescreen was giving forth an ear-splitting whistle which continued the same note for 30 seconds. It was not 7:15, getting up time for office workers. He was doubled up by a violent coughing fit, which nearly always attacked him soon after waking up. 30 to 40 group, take your places, please. 30 to 40. Arms bending and stretching. 1, 2, 3, 4. Come on, comrades, put a bit of life into it. Winston was wearing on his face the look of grim enjoyment which was considered proper during the physical jerks. He was struggling to think his way backward into the dim period of his early childhood. It was extraordinarily difficult when there were no external records that you could refer to. Even the outline of your own life lost its sharpness. Okay, so this is an important point here. He doesn't have photographs. He doesn't have diaries. He doesn't have other people to compare his life with memories of other people. So today, if we are not sure about an event that happens, we give our version of it, and then people either correct or confirm that. He doesn't have that. So he's not sure if he has these memories or if they're actually just dreams and this never happened. So it's something very important as well. Now, also notice, and we saw this earlier in the chapter 2, how they refer to one another as comrades. Okay, so it says 30 to 40 group, come on, comrades, put some, life into it right here. So the word comrades obviously is a military term. Okay, so it's like your brother in the military. So everybody is at all times prepared for war, as probably why they're even making office workers do this. So remember, that was one quality that we saw of a totalitarian and authoritarian regime, is this focus on war, and that's distracting to the people. So if they keep them in this constant busy attitude, there's very little time for them to think and act. Everything had been different then. Even the names of the countries and their shapes on the maps had been different. Airstrip 1, for instance, had not been called in those days. It had been called England or Britain. Though London, he felt fairly certain, had always been called London. Remember, that's where he lives, London. Winston could not definitely remember a time when his country had not been at war. It was evident that there had been a fairly long interval of peace during his childhood, because one of his early memories was an air raid which had appeared to take everyone by surprise. Perhaps it was the time when the atomic bomb had fallen on Colchester. He did remember his father's hand clutching his own as they hurried down to some place deep in the earth, round and round a spiral staircase. Finally, they had emerged into a noisy, crowded place which had realized to be a true station. We didn't ought to have trusted them. I said so, Ma, didn't I? We didn't ought to have trusted the buggers. But which buggers they did not to have trusted, Winston could not now remember. Since about that time, war had been literally continuous, but to trace out the history of the whole period, to say who was fighting whom at any given moment, would have been utterly impossible, since there was no written record. At this moment, for example, in 1984, if it was 1984, Oceania was at war with Eurasia and in alliance with East Asia. In no public or private utterance was it ever admitted that the three powers had at any different time been grouped along different lines. Actually, as Winston well knew it had only been 4 years since Oceania had been at war with East Asia and alliance with Eurasia. But that was merely a piece of furtive knowledge which he happened to possess because his memory was not satisfactorily under control. Officially, the change of partners had never happened. The enemy of the movement always represented absolute evil, and it followed that any past or future agreement with him was impossible. If the party could thrust its hand into the past and say that this or that event had never happened, that surely was more terrifying than mere torture and death. So not only are the people that control the present controlling the future, but they're also controlling the past. So we see this in our world, this attempt to rewrite history to change the narrative. So they're essentially gaslighting every one of their citizens, making them think that you did not believe, what you thought you remember. Okay, you shouldn't believe that. Your memory is flawed. We are the party. What we say is law. If all accepted the lie, it passed into history and became the truth. All that was needed was an unending series of victories over your own memory. Who controls the past? Ran the party's slogan, controls the future. Who controls the present? Controls the past. Winston sank his arms into his sides and slowly refilled his lungs with air. Stand easy. His mind slid away into the labyrinth world of doublethink. To know and to not know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies, to hold simultaneously two opinions which canceled out knowing them to be contradictory and believing in both of them, to use logic against logic, to repudiate morality while laying claim to it, to believe that democracy was impossible and that the party was the guardian of democracy, to forget whatever it was necessary to forget, then to draw it back into memory again at the moment when it was needed, and then promptly to forget it again. And above all, to apply the same process to the process itself. That was the ultimate subtlety. Consciously to induce unconsciousness, and then once again to become unconscious of the act of hypnosis you had just performed. Even to understand the word doublethink involved the use of doublethink. Okay, so doublethink is these two contrasting ideas existing simultaneously. Okay, so two contrasting ideas in one's head existing at the same time. That's doublethink. And now let's see which of us can touch our toes. He tried to remember what year he had first heard mention of Big Brother. He thought it must have been at sometime in the 60s, but it was impossible to be certain. In the party histories, of course, Big Brother figured as the leader and guardian of the revolution since its very earliest days. His exploits had been gradually pushed backward in time until already they extended into the fabulous world of the 40s and 30s, when the capitalists in their strange cylindrical hats still rode through the streets of London in great gleaming motor cars. Winston could not even remember at what date the party itself had come into existence. And remember, Ingsoc means English socialism. I would write that down. English socialism, Ingsoc. He did not believe he had ever heard the word Ingsoc before, but it was possible that in the old speak form, English socialism, that is to say, it had been current earlier. Everything melted into mist. Sometimes, indeed, you could put your finger on a definite lie. It was not true, for example, as it was claimed in the party history, that the party had invented airplanes. Winston remembered airplanes since his earliest childhood, but you could prove nothing. Just once in his whole life, he had held in his hands unmistakable documentary proof that falsification of a historical fact. And on that occasion, Smith, 6079 Smith W. Yes, you, bend lower, please. You're not trying. Lower, please. Winston, with a violent lunge, succeeded in touching his toes with knees unbent for the first time in several years. Okay. So again, they're pulling him out of his memories and letting him know that his thoughts are drifting. So we don't see in this world, where people's thoughts are monitored or anything like that, but we do see where they're clearly seeing that he's distracted. Okay? So we have a lot of interesting information here. Winston is a rebel. He understands the flaws and the lies that his party upholds, but he feels powerless to stop it. Okay, and so that's an important aspect. As the novel continues, he gains inner strength. He starts to question more things. And if he can find, other like-minded people, then maybe they can actually do something. All right, so this is chapter 2 and 3 of 1984. Thank you all for listening. Please let me know if you have any questions.